Welcome to Bleach Revisited. I am Kergold, your host in this series in which we will be reading every single chapter of the Bleach manga, providing critical analysis of the art and narrative, as well as personal response to each of these chapters. We'll also be discussing how the individual chapter connects to the rest of the manga as a whole. As usual, we begin these videos with a reading of the chapter that we are currently discussing for the episode. This is Chapter 113, The Undead 3, Closing Frantica. Assistant Captain Kusajishi, I have an urgent message for you. Okay, come back later. I'm sorry, but with all due respect, this is a top secret message signed by Captain General Yamamoto and Captain Hitsugaya of the 10th Company. Fine. Tell me later. That's not possible, Assistant Captain. I was ordered to deliver this message to all captains and assistant captains immediately. Quiet. Don't bother me while Kenny's fighting. Ah! Bleach, Chapter 113, The Undead 3, Closing Frantica. What? His spiritual pressure increased when he took off his eye patch? Hey, no fair. You can't bring out something new this late in the game. What have you got hidden in that eye of yours? Hidden eye. Ha! You think I'd cheat? I had research and development department make this for me. These little monsters gobble up spirit energy. And now, I can use all the power they consumed. To kill you. It's that simple. Can you hear it, Ichigo? The sound of his sword screaming. Yeah. He can't hear it. When those who don't trust each other fight together, the strength in each is diminished. Those who trust only in their own strength can't comprehend that. Ichigo, can you trust me? Of course. All of my strength is yours. Use it however you want, and lend me your strength. All right. Hey, your spiritual pressure's increasing again. Good. Of course it did. I'm borrowing Zangetsu's power. We fight as a team. I'm not losing to somebody like you who fights all alone. Zangetsu. Is that the name of your Zanpakuto? And you're borrowing the power of your Zanpakuto and fighting as a unit? Nonsense. A Zanpakuto is a weapon. Teaming up with a Zanpakuto is the way of a loser who can no longer fight on his own. For warriors like us. It's unworthy, Ichigo! Here he comes. I can't stop your bleeding for much longer. We only have one shot. sorry. Guys. What do you have to be sorry for? You won. Fool. And that is it for Bleach Chapter 113, The Undead 3. Oh boy, subtitle. Frantic Finale. It's almost certainly not Frantic Finale. Watch it. Watch what you write. No, Closing Frantica. Frantic Finale. But it is 113. It is The Undead 3. And it is time to talk about this chapter. Let's discuss the art and the narrative. Let's talk about kind of what's going on. And again, typical of Kubo to give us this wide aerial shot. It's surprising how many of these that we get. And it actually makes me think, I think Asterisk, the first Bleach opening, has like a quick flick up the sky as part of its like opening sequence, and I think that's kind of telling because that kind of quick flick the sky or that settled down in from sky. I don't know. It's interesting how often Kubo uses that as a scene setting move, that we get the clouds like that, and of course. The gathered clouds, the various scattered clouds take on perhaps a little bit more meaning in light of what we had last chapter with old man Zengetsu expressing, that there were those clouds that gathered and he would rather they not rain and all of that. So perhaps gathered clouds can be a symbol of a storm to come or a conflict brewing, maybe. I don't know. That might be looking a little bit too much into it. Overall, I think this is just a good kind of visual way that Kubo can do something easy to establish, hey, we're moving somewhere else in the scenery. It reads pretty quickly. Here we have that Rite Tai guy, basically that messenger sent to give that message. If you remember from a few chapters back, he is the one who delivered the news about Aizen's murder and death. Like the actual official declaration of Captain Sosuke Aizen's death was given by this fellow. And so it's interesting here, he comes here to deliver the news. And I like that he's not trying to deliver it to Zaraki, because Zaraki's obviously in the middle of this battle. But instead, he's going to tell this to Yachiru, Vice Captain or Assistant Captain Kusajishi, right? And it's interesting we get this shot from her from behind, her face obscured by this dialogue. And I know his face is obscured as well, but hers kind of menacingly so. Interestingly enough, that he has this kind of thing to hide his face, this kind of mask of sorts. We did see something a little similar to that design back whenever Byakuya and Renji initially showed up in the realm of the living, right? That they had these sort of mask on that they pulled off. This seems to be a different kind of design, but it's interesting that there are these sort of different facial coverings and masks that are present within the Soul Society. Interestingly enough, I don't remember that the anime actually depicts Renji and Byakuya with those masks. I think this guy is depicted the same in both the anime and the manga, but it's been a long time since I've watched these episodes, y'all, so I couldn't say for sure. That said, kind of faceless messenger guy. Interestingly enough, I can only speculate as to why exactly he has this kind of design, but I don't have anything really great for you. It's just notable, kind of distinguishes him as different. And interestingly enough, his Shihaku show has this kind of overcoat to it. Yeah. Yeah, I like the kind of layered whites and blacks of his design. His little goatee, you know, this nameless messenger fella. But I like that he's trying to like really insist on the significance of this, and for Yachiru, the only thing that really matters is this fight. I like that we get like, interestingly enough, we've gotten a kind of a couple different kind of glimpses of characters Reiatsu in this chapter, especially, but it's Yachiru's that we actually get first. Now, you did have somewhat of a glimpse of like Reiatsu taking kind of a facial aspect back whenever Ichigo was fighting White in his internal world. But it was much more loose. It wasn't as clear as this. Whereas Yachiru's clearly got like, this kind of ferocious beast, some sort of tiger-like Reiatsu, as she like just kind of cuts back to this guy to say, don't bother her while Kenpachi is fighting. And again, it kind of it highlights like where the 11th's concerns are, right? Where especially Zaraki and the Yachiru, who very much seems to be in the same mental space as Zaraki. Like she is really captivated by the fight, and that's what she cares about. She doesn't care about all this plotting stuff. Neither does Zaraki, as far as we can tell, right? Like as he said, he doesn't care really about the Rukia stuff. He doesn't really care for that, and the Yachiru also doesn't seem to care for that, right? Because she stayed back to just watch him fight as well. I do like that here we get the Rietsu kind of burning the air, his spiritual power. Like I love just the way that it's depicted here, almost like it's smoking off of him. That it's like flames and smoke alike. It's really cool. I always love the visuals for characters having power in Bleach. The sort of energy that kind of licks off of them. I thought it was always pretty coolly demonstrated. And like I love that Zaraki himself, instead of being given the full blacks, he's given like these very sketchy, straight kind of lines to further emphasize like this power that's just leaking up off of him. And of course, the defiance of gravity. It's reminiscent, of course, of Toriyama's own, like the Super Saiyan or Kaioken. Who I'll get that right. But basically, in Dragon Ball and Dragon Ball Z, for those who are familiar with it, basically everywhere else in the world. But Dragon Ball has, the characters have these sorts of energy-based power-ups that they do. And they get an aura of different sorts, and it tends to kind of start to like levitate. And so, like this sort of imagery for evoking power is something that's already been done in a stylistic way that's sort of been figured out, perhaps, right? And it's not wholly unique to Dragon Ball. I'm sure there's other manga that have very similar sorts of characters gathering energy and power. You can look to things like Fist of the North Star, even JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, and even to manga before those. But here, I think it's very likely that Kubo is taking direct inspiration from Dragon Ball. He's a noted fan of the series. Interestingly enough, I say all of that, but it is Naruto that shares way more in common with Dragon Ball and Hunter x Hunter than Bleach, which doesn't quite. But has some visual cues certainly that it takes. But yeah, I like that it's just this the way that the Rietsu is depicted. Especially, I love the lines kind of coming up off of his coat, the way things kind of lift into the air, the way that like you can see some of the spikes of his hair drawn outside the line. That sketchiness of style. It's interesting because that's something that I was kind of holding in the past, like that kind of sketchier aspect as perhaps a weakness of Kubo's, and it's neat to see it leveraged as a strength. Like, okay, well, I do have sketchier lines, and I do like the sketchier shading, And, being able to lean into that for these really powerful scenes, I think is really cool. It's neat that instead of, really polishing up that aspect of his style, he kept that in his toolkit as something that he could use. So, yeah, it's something to think about. Like if you have like something that you perceive as a weakness in your art, think about like, well, what is it accomplishing? And if it's a weakness, like, what is it not accomplishing? Like, what can you use it for? Because if you draw in a certain way, you do it for some reason. Um, it's either because you enjoy it, or because you like the way that it looks, or because it's some sort of visual shorthand for, what would take more effort or skill to execute, right? And so it's interesting to kind of parse between those and figure out what you actually do want to do. I don't claim to be like a master artist or art instructor, so if I'm wrong here, I'm wrong here. I have had several years of formal art education, but you know, never pursued a degree in that. I never wanted to make it my job, so I didn't. Um, but yeah, it's interesting that like I really like that Kubo kept that sketchiness to use in these moments because he realized like how effective it was for these kind of high power, high octane moments. And I love that it gets taken to the next level with like this huge beam that flies up through from Zaraki, this massive channeling energy. I like that Ichigo has to brace from it. All the different kind of depictions of that energy here, from Zaraki and like the lines kind of skewing up off of him, the way that it shoots upward in this kind of just powerful arc, this helix that comes around it is really cool. I like that the arc splits even the SFX at the top. It just creates a very dynamic and powerful kind of visual, and I like that it becomes kind of smoke and debris back where Ichigo is. Yeah, it's definitely multifaceted, and I think that's one of the things that I also really like is that typically whenever power is displayed in Bleach, there's a lot of facets of how that power gets conveyed. Um, and I think whenever Kubo's really knocking out the park, he's conveying that power, not just in the character looking and presenting as powerful, but in the way that they affect their environment and the way that others are reacting to it and everything. And I think here is just fantastic. I love Ichigo with like the guard up, across his face. Because interestingly enough, Zangetsu is a sword that doesn't have a guard, so he uses the entire flat of the blade to protect himself. And I like Ichigo with just the one eye peeking out, and then we get cut by the panel, the single open eye of Zaraki, now that he has ripped off this kind of squirming eye patch of his. It's cool stuff. Like, I love the reflection of the two. And I like that how cool Ichigo plays it so cool here as he lowers his sword to like assume a fighting stance, and he's like, hey, not any fair. You're like, it's such a man. I like Ichigo, like the way that he approaches and the way that he kind of keeps his composure in these moments and the sort of dialogue that he has. I really do love him as a protagonist. I think these are moments that highlight like why Ichigo is a fun protagonist, because like he's talking like in this sort of way. He's still got this attitude to him. He's still got this sort of like he's trying to get at like the actual thing that's happening here, but he's kind of presenting it in a very relaxed way, even though we have seen how shocked he is from just the page ago. And I do love here like that we have like this back and forth dialogue that's presented in frame. Like we have Ichigo left aligned, Zaraki right aligned down the page this way. And I like that Ichigo has Zangetsu placed in front of him, whereas Zaraki just has his raw spiritual energy. And again, like there's a lot this chapter. There's a ton this chapter that really allies Ichigo with Zangetsu, which is really cool, and really shows Zaraki as not like one with his weapon, and I like that. And I mean to an even kind of larger degree, here we have Ichigo, and he's fighting with all that he has here. He's fighting alongside his allies. Yet Zaraki isn't fighting alongside his sword at all. But even furthermore, he's his assistant captain, his adjutant. Oh boy, Yachiru is just sitting and watching, like she's not fighting alongside him, even though she could be. And so it really, I think, the isolation of Zaraki versus Ichigo really being presented here. And I love that we do have Old Man Zangetsu actually like materialize there with Ichigo later. I think it just speaks volumes towards the difference where these two combatants are coming from. Yeah, I always found it kind of creepy that we get this close up of the eye patch, that it's got like it's actually this kind of organic thing that's constantly devouring his spiritual energy. And now that he doesn't have something that's constantly like eating it up, it can kind of be released full blast. Kind of interesting. Yeah, yeah, little nasty thing. It's interesting to think like, oh, I had research and development make this for me. Like who do you think Zaraki asked, right? Because it doesn't seem like he and Mayuri get on all too well, right? The captain Mayuri Kuratsuchi. So I wonder, exactly what the case is, and it's like, Zaraki, why did you like why would they agree to like chain his power in this way? Um, maybe that's like, perhaps he asked and Mayuri thought it would be something that perhaps he could make that would like hurt Kenpachi even. I don't know. When I say Kenpachi, I mean Zaraki here. Again, I always, it's easy to refer to Zaraki as Kenpachi, even though Kenpachi is just his title. Because I mean, no one else is running around calling themselves Kenpachi, so it's all one and the same, Um, this panel took me a little bit. Like, this is the one panel I think in the entirety of this chapter that I think I had a little bit of difficulty reading, as he's dropped the eye patch and it's kind of falling to the ground, and we get him, from that angle up. I wish maybe that could have been conveyed a little bit better here, because he's holding it at kind of face height, and then he drops it here. I mean, it's not completely illegible, but I think the fact that his text box hides a little bit of his face, it's maybe a little hard to grok at first glance. And then here he whips his hand over to his sword and then slashes aside, and I love this just incredible zoom out. We see this entire building collapse, and I hope there was nobody in there. But yes, we get his raw sort of power. And I love that Ichigo, instead of being completely thrown by this or terrified, he just focuses. And this is one of my favorite visuals, is Ichigo, holding Zangetsu forward, ready to face his opponent. I love this zoom in that we have Ichigo, and he has this scar, this cut across his cheek from whenever he cut. So if you remember earlier in the fight, this is something I really like, is that all the wounds stay pretty consistent in Bleach, at least in their fights. Now, I don't know if you're going to see Renji still depicted with the cut to his chin that he sustained from the initial encounter with Ichigo. It might be a little bit too long to keep showing that. I saw it here and there whenever we were, several chapters back, but I didn't always make a note of it. That said, this is like this cut that Ichigo has is from whenever he cut across Kenpachi's face, and he got cut across his face, and as a result, interestingly enough, here Ichigo has this moment where his face is completely clean the second that Old Man Zangetsu appears, and I love this this kind of moment of Old Man Zangetsu speaking towards him, holding Zangetsu forward, and we get this warped, sort of distorted view of Zaraki Zanpakuto, right? That it's like crying out, that it is essentially being wielded against its own desires, right? Yeah, they don't trust each other. You could see like literally his sword being torn apart by its energy. And again, I think that's like one really big thing is as powerful as Zaraki is, he is essentially made his weapon his own tool for fighting rather than fighting alongside it. Uh, like they could accomplish so much more together, but Zaraki is so much the person to like insist upon his own individuality and his own will, that he's not willing to actually make those bonds. And I think it's interesting because Zaraki, in a way, represents the dangers of a highly individualistic persona. Whereas Ichigo, it's very common that Ichigo is going to be placed up against opponents that ultimately fight on the side of the society, right? Be that the Soul Society or otherwise, but that represent this kind of larger, either naturalistic force in the Hollows or societal force in the Shinigami. And then Ichigo, as he clashes against them, he's going to have these foes like Renji, like Byakuya, um, you know, that ultimately will get in his way, despite whatever their personal misgivings may be, because they have this mandate, this order, because their society, wants them to stop Ichigo, regardless of how they personally feel about him. Um, and Zaraki is so much different. Zaraki is like, I want to fight Ichigo because he's strong, because I personally want to fight him. And Zaraki has like that incredible strength of his own willpower. Um, but he's not able to make those same sorts of bonds. I mean, he has all these people that look up to him, certainly, in the entire 11th Division. But as far as, actually fighting alongside somebody, he sees that as weakness, and that maybe speaks towards a larger weakness among the 11th, even. And certainly, like, if you think about it, if uh, Yamachika and Ikaku both fought Ichigo at once at the same time, they might be able to overcome him in that fight. But they didn't. They split up. They really value this sort of individualistic combat, the same way that the Zaraki does. So I think he's like a bad model for that. Nevertheless, yeah, it's kind of interesting that he so much is that individual. He still is operating within a society, but he's the power to kind of not really be beholden to its structures and its strictures and its laws. He just benefits from this one sector of society that he's been able to find himself granted worthiness in. So it's interesting. Like there's still a little bit of like societal, inner working that like he's still cognizant of where he's able to fit in and like thrive in society, but that gives him the power to not really have to be an agent of society whatsoever. And yeah, I mean, like Ichigo in a lot of ways does the same thing, but I think Ichigo is more willing to actually make those connections, to actually, find those that would be his ally, to actually integrate more of those aspects of whatever group he's a part of. And yeah, I like that, we cut back here. And it's interesting, he's got the no cut here. It's all internal. And then as Zangetsu sort of starts to fade, even we get back to him having this cut on his cheek. And I like that he's like, look, I'm going to lend you all my strength. You can lend me yours. Let's fight alongside each other. And so it's cool. Like Ichigo's pouring his energy into Zangetsu, and vice versa. Zangetsu is pulling this energy from Ichigo as well as presenting his own energy. And it's neat that like it becomes this synchronous thing or synchronous sort of thing, right? That it's like you've created this entity separate from you. It is a living entity, but it is a blade, and it exists to cut, and so it will draw upon your energy to better cut, but it also has its own energy that you can draw forth to cut as well. And it's neat that like that sort of thing is the power of the Shinigami, and ultimately, while the power of the Shinigami is this highly individualistic thing that is all about creating a bond with this thing external to you. We're already seeing how the different characters have different relationships in that bond. Um, Certainly, Zaraki is one to neglect his and just exert his willpower over it entirely. But yeah, I like that a lot. That, like, despite the society being so militaristic, it derives, the individual still derives their power, not just being a part of this larger military unit, but because they're given these weapons that allow them to kind of fight alongside each other. So there's something sort of societalistic about it, but there's also something highly individual about it. And those things kind of can be at odds, which is interesting. It's something that we'll talk about whenever we talk about some more of the Zanpakuto as we move forward, and a little bit more of what they end up representing, and what facets of the characters they can really bring forth. But yes, I love the shot of the kind of wider grip of Zangetsu as Old Man Zangetsu reaches down, and I really like the way that this page is framed. Um, like this him looking down, that Old Man Zangetsu's eye glances down, and we immediately get him looking down to where his hand is going to grasp the sword. And I love this, burst of energy again from Ichigo, and I like that it mirrors Zaraki's, and then it's this huge upward kind of burst that bursts through the SFX there. And I like, yeah, of course, like Ichigo being like, yeah, of course my power is going up. I'm borrowing from Zangetsu. We're fighting together. Like, that Zangetsu isn't just an expression of Ichigo's power, but is this entity separate of Ichigo and born of Ichigo that can resonate with him in this way and fight as a team. I think that's really cool. And yeah, I love that Zaraki kind of calls that out, right? Because for Zaraki, he sees that as a weakness. Like, he's only been able to really rely on his own strength, on his own power, because ultimately, I mean, like, that's a big thing. Is like having to rely on somebody else. If that person lets you down, if that thing lets you down, like, that's what causes trauma. Like, if you want to feel like you're totally in control of a situation, you need to be able to exert your own personal control over that situation. And that's kind of the conclusion that Zaraki's come to, that he can't. He's so caught up in, like, what power is for him and what control is for him, that he's almost incapable of trust. At the very least, in a martial sense and with a weapon, whenever life is on the line, which, I don't think is completely unreasonable. But yeah, the way that he berates Ichigo, that he says, you're not fighting on your own, you loser, right? Warriors like us, it's unworthy. And here we get that kind of manifestation of Zaraki's, power, and it's that this crazed skull that rises up out of him, and I love that. Here we get direct absolutely told, like, Zangetsu's like, look, I can't stop your bleeding for much longer. So again, it's confirmation from earlier that it is, in fact, Old Man Zangetsu that is staunching Ichigo's bleeding, to answer the question that Zaraki had. So that is perhaps a power of Ichigo's. Useful power, that. And I love here that we get this manifestation of course, Ichigo's own power. And it doesn't take, a particularly eagle-eyed person to realize that this power is reflective of that hollow mask that he had on him before. It's got the stripes. It's got the same sort of serpentine, cat-like eyes. It's got the kind of, like, skull-like teeth. And so, it's exciting to kind of see, like, oh man, if Ichigo's power kind of manifests, if his Rietsu is manifesting in that way, what is that telling us? Like, how much of his power is really, I mean, ultimately grown from that revival of the Shattered Shaft, right? Whenever that mask initially was formed, and he was able to actually call forth Zangetsu after that moment, right? That's all tied into his strength. And so it's neat that they both have these sort of, both Zaraki and Ichigo have these clashing sort of like death mask that Ryatsu takes for the kind of, I guess, the visage of death, a skull for both of them, the undead, right? And of course, we get this big clash. They finally charge at each other. I love the close-ups for both, especially like Kenpachi's looking great here. I love the very satisfied, cocksure smile. Ichigo very serious. The close-up of Ichigo's eye, I do think, is really great there. And then we get, of course, the double page, which I will have to do there, where we get them clashing and we get this like smattering of buildings, that the energy coming together is massive, and we get this little trickle of blood at the end. Yeah, it's cool stuff. I mean, there are more exciting maybe 2-page spreads, but it certainly helps to sell the power of these two colossal forces coming together. And I like that we finally do get this final image of like what is essentially, which is me trying to zoom in. We'll get there if we get there. There we go. That we linger on this final image. I like the blood sprayed across the floor there. But Ichigo with Zangetsu cleaved like past the shoulder of Zaraki, almost kind of tearing his entire arm off, while Zaraki has his Zanpakuto piercing straight through Ichigo's back. And I think more viscerally is the moment that comes afterwards. But I just love like the cast of light across their Shihakusho. This kind of powerful, silent moment of the two of them locked in a lover's embrace. Yeah, like the very kind of dedicated, blood-stained visages of both. And, Ichigo apologizes and is the first to fall here. I love the lines around Ichigo's eye, and then he pulls to the side and just like, ugh, like from the other side of the navel all the way across Ichigo's chest, like you could see his innards. It's absolutely grotesque. And again, like this is, the anime did a pretty good job with this fight, but I think like the absolute viscerality of these wounds, like Ichigo's almost cut in half at this moment. And he just collapses, blood all over the floor. And I like that Zaraki is able to stand here and his arm almost completely is torn off, splattering blood everywhere. And I love that, like, he lifts his sword. He says, what do you have to be sorry for? And we see the break in his own weapon as it shatters. And he expresses that Ichigo won, right? And then he collapses as well. So it's kind of a stalemate, I like the kind of the rain of blood, the spattering of blood at the end of here to really punctuate the end of their encounter. Yeah, it's neat stuff, and it finally kind of brings to an end, a close, this most massive of duels that we've had. We haven't had a fight like this yet of this magnitude in the Soul Society arc, and I think this is really starting to kind of pay off, like how significant the fights are going to be moving forward. That this really sets a bar for what we can expect. That said, Chad already is pretty much taken out of the fight. He had a lot less of a significant sort of over-the-top battle as far as things go. And that he wasn't able to really match Shensui's power. But we know that Orihime and Uryu and Mr. Yorichi are all still out there. So we have to wonder what's going on with them. And of course, Ganju and Hanataro are rushing to save Rukia. Yeah. It's interesting here, like Ichigo does stop Zaraki, but like You also wonder, well, it doesn't seem like Zaraki was really going to go try and stop the others anyway. He just wanted this battle with Ichigo. So it's like, did Ichigo really even buy them time? I don't know. It's hard to express. Like, you can assume that maybe Zaraki wouldn't have let them go by because he wanted this battle with Ichigo. Um, but yeah, it's the sort of thing where it's like, well, if he would have won against Ichigo, I don't think Zaraki would have, like, if capable, would have really necessarily gone to chase down Ganju and Hinataro. I feel like my throat is squeaking a bunch. It's weird. I'm sorry if you're hearing me I just feel like there's like a squeakiness in my throat, like a, I don't know, like there's like a squeaky toy in there. Every now and then I just hear like a bizarre. I apologize for any of that. Let me check me real. Yeah, this isn't the. There's more to this volume. So yeah, that said, this is not the end of the volume. There are still more chapters yet to go. So we will see how this volume concludes. But we can basically say that this fight seems well and over. To talk a little bit about the chapter and my take on it and some of my thoughts, I do like this chapter. I do like this ultimate kind of clash. I think it ends in a satisfying way for me, where it's like no one side really outright devastates the others, and it's made really clear why Ichigo is able to overcome Zaraki, and like where Zaraki's shortcomings are. Like, I think it's satisfying in a way that like the mechanics of it are clear. That said, it also serves as like a pretty just kind of visually cool fight, all things said. I do like this moment that stands out pretty severely whenever Yichiru calls back on this guy, and we get the sense that Yichiru herself is pretty, like, I was about to say pretty satisfying, weird, pretty scary, pretty capable. She is a vice captain herself, so you would imagine that being vice captain Zaraki Kenpachi and seeing him get to enjoy such a wonderful battle, which seems to be a rarity. It's something that she does not want to be disturbed in the middle of, and I like that ferocity of hers coming out, because that's a side of her we haven't really seen yet, right? And I think it reflects like the kind of easygoing nature of kids that can quickly become violent or quickly snap at somebody, right? Kids are cruel. Um, yeah, it's neat stuff. I do like it quite a bit. Let's talk about spoilers. Let's talk about how this connects to the rest of Bleach. And I think one thing that I do want to bring up with Yachiru and like talking about her as a child, like her being a kid and her like kind of responding really aggressively, I think here reflects like the immaturity of his Senpakuto, right? That it hasn't been given really time to develop or been given that much attention, and really Zaraki hasn't addressed Ichiro whatsoever. Like, she is sidelined on this fight and just made to watch, despite how powerful she could be and how powerful, how much power she could lend to Zaraki. Yeah, I like that bestial sort of visage. I like that, like, you can kind of see maybe how that might link to. I mean, like, the sort of Oni like transformation Zaraki has with his Bankai. Um, yeah. Nevertheless, of course, cool chapter. All things considered. There isn't a ton I want. I mean, like, the eye patch stuff comes up. It will continue to be a thing. I believe that the eye patch is also the same sort of binding. I don't know if they use a creature that's constantly consuming spiritual pressure, but I think the eye patch is maybe meant to be a similar sort of thing to what they strap Aizen up in. I could be wrong, but I always read the sort of black bindings that Aizen had to be sort of similar to this eye patch situation, that Zaraki has, like this sort of sealing device, right? Yeah, like old man Zangetsu with his hand on Ichigo's shoulder is great stuff. Yeah, the whole like lend me your strength, of course. You can definitely read like there being this. Obviously, Zangetsu has quite a lot of strength to wield, but I tend to read this as much as a synthesis of actual use of Shinigami powers, but also perhaps even Quincy stuff. Obviously, we get the Blut Vene kind of brought up here, right? That I can't stop your bleeding very much longer. As we know, that is strictly a Quincy ability. I'll say it 1,001 times. Yeah, it's interesting. Like this idea of the Ryatsu being like taking like a certain shape or form. That's not really something that we see very much of in the rest of the manga. I think it's really cool here, and I think like certainly the hollow sort of like masked Reiatsu of Ichigo is telling. It's definitely reflective of the fact that like his powers are born of hollowification. Um, yeah, I mean the Zenpakuto that he wields in front of you is not like an Asuichi that has been imprinted in the same way that everybody else's is. It's like a manifested blade, you know. So yeah, it's neat stuff. I do think that like interesting that Zaraki cuts a building to kind of demonstrate his power here, and it's not even like his true power ultimately. Maybe reflective of how whenever Ichigo fights Gin, the same thing. Gin cuts like several of the buildings in Karakura, but that's just to kind of display a falsity of his power. His actual power is like doing the Kamishini no Yari. So perhaps there's something kind of reflected there that like Zaraki's power isn't really like what he's just demonstrating here, but it's this power that he'd later awaken to. A power that he keeps under wraps because it's like wrapped up in his sheath. It's wrapped up. But I do like that, he expresses this idea, right? That teaming up with Zanpakuto is the way of a loser who can no longer fight on his own, and that warriors, fight with this power. And you can see why, like, there's this particular kind of shame, especially with, you know, like admitting towards perhaps use of Bankai and Ikaku. Although Ikaku attests that he doesn't want anyone to know he has a Bankai because he doesn't want to take a captaincy position. He'd rather continue to serve in the 11th, which I think that's a fair kind of point from him. But this certainly is an attitude that Yumachika, kind of holds to, right? That he'd look down upon should he be using that more kind of keto type or non-physical type Zenpakuto. Yeah. And that he should rely on like more of a physical type that relies further on like his own power. Even if it is, again, literally rendering him weaker to do that. Yeah, I don't know that there's really anything else here in this chapter that I want to say connects to other elements. Obviously, big wounds for our characters. Interesting that Zaraki almost loses an arm, which that's what happens to everyone in Bleach. You gotta lose your arm. His sword does get broken. But, Zaraki would come the next time that we see him really. Well, we get to see him fighting a little bit more in this arc, right? Because we do get the fight that he has with both Komamura and Tosen later. But we don't really get to see him like evolve his strength until we see him use both arms. So it's interesting that he almost loses an arm to Ichigo. I think that's just like a cool kind of connection. As far as Ichigo like wounding his opponent but not winning, I mean that's been common throughout. Like that's what happened with Grand Fisher. That's what happened here. But it's sort of, kind of. I mean, like he defeats Renji pretty soundly, I would say, in that fight with Renji here. But yeah, it's interesting the way that Ichigo like hardly ever gets like a clear cut win. I mean, he beats Chidambo at the beginning of this, but yeah, it's neat that Ichigo isn't always the one to just take a W. That it's always kind of hard fought. I like that about him. And we're going to continue to see that. I mean, he doesn't get a clear win against Baikua. And then he gets smacked around by Grimmjow a whole bunch. And then he's able to... finally, I think he ends up kind of overcoming a few of the lesser, the Primarana Spada and all of that. Until he gets back to Grimmjow and later to Ulquiorra. And we know how those fights go. And then after that, he's basically it's Aizen, like, and then we get a quick reset. We do Fullbringer arc, which I mean he does get a pretty clear win against Genjo there. And then really, like, I mean, he's got a pretty hard-fought battle against Kirige OP. I'm trying to think of the other battles that he does in Thousand Year Blood War, other than the final fight, which he loses a few times until he wins. Oh. Yeah, it's weird. Ichigo often doesn't get like a straight out and out win. It's interesting. Curious that, But I like that. Like it makes his triumphs feel that much more kind of hard fought, hard won. But yeah, that's it for this chapter. That's all I had to say for this one. If there's anything that you saw that you'd like to talk about, anything that you talk about, spoilers, make sure to tag your comment appropriately. Thank you so much for joining me through this reading and through this discussion of the chapter. Yeah, I'm interested to hear your thoughts, how you feel about this fight, how you feel about its conclusion, all of that. So please do let me know. Please give the video a like. And if you'd like to support me in another way, if you'd like to support the channel in another way, you can always follow the Patreon link in the description and support there. Everyone who supports in the Patreon will be shown on this card at the very end of every episode. This is all of our current supporters right now. Thank you very much for your support. I do appreciate it. And yeah, this has been Karkur Gold, reminding you that spirits are forever with you. Stay gold.